From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Thursday, October 5. This week, early voting began for the Voice to Parliament referendum at centres across the country. Support for an Indigenous voice to Parliament seems to have been in a steady decline since last year. But now, a new poll suggests that the yes vote has, for the first time in many months, gained some ground. We won't know the outcome of this latest referendum until next weekend, but we can glean a lot of insight from our history, in particular the 44 constitutional referendums we've had, in addition to dozens more state-based votes on everything from pub closing times to conscription. Today, economics correspondent Shane Wright on why referendums so often fail in Australia, and what the academic who predicted Brexit says about the upcoming vote on the Voice to Parliament. So Shane, this week, early voting for the referendum on the Voice to Parliament began. It's obviously very early, but has any exit polling been done that can give us a sense of which way people are voting?
No, we haven't seen any exit polling yet. And there are question marks about exit polling in this country, particularly at the pre-poll voting booths, because people who tend to vote at those are slightly different to those who roll up for their democracy sausage on October 14. So, yeah, I wouldn't put any faith in any exit polling at the moment because, there's just too many questions about it. I'm very hardcore when it comes to my polling samples and things like that, and I go, no, not for this.
And our latest polling, it won't come out until later this week. But before that, what are the polls, more generally speaking, showing right now?
That no is going to win and win comfortably. We actually have a poll this week from The Guardian, their essential poll, which was the first that anyone has seen in months where there's been an increase in the yes vote. They still have it 49-43. No versus yes, a 2-point lift in the yes vote, but that is also within the margin of error of that poll. So if we go through the other polls that are floating around, our September Resolve poll was at 57-43, Redbridge is at 62-38, Morgan's at 44-39, News polls at 64-36, and there is some analysis of the polls, which is actually not a bad way to pull together all the various polling that's going on, and that's got it at no 58, yes 42, which in the history of referendums, which is what this whole podcast is about, is actually really par for the course. A low yes vote in the 40s up until the 45s is more common than anything.
Okay, and Shane, the reason we wanted to talk to you about this today is because you recently wrote this incredible story for our papers about, as you just mentioned, the history of referendums in Australia. And it had a great title. It's called The Tale of the One-Legged Pilot, Why Referendums Often Fail to Land. So before we get into the why, can you please tell me about this unusual referendum that inspired that headline?
So the 1937 referendum was caused by a barnstorming biplane pilot by the name of Henry Goyer Henry. He had been flying around Sydney, including flying under the Sydney Harbour Bridge. He'd got pinged by federal law for flying too low over Mascot Airfield. He'd been fined £1 and he'd lost his pilot's licence. Now, Henry had a lawyer friend who said, I don't think this sticks because the federal government should not have responsibility over what you were doing here in Sydney. It went all the way to the High Court, and the High Court stuck with Henry. This is a guy who had killed a passenger in a plane crash in the early 1930s. He'd been in a car crash where he'd been clearly drinking sherry. He would ultimately lose his licence later, but the key issue was he challenged the ability of the federal government to set aviation law, which, according to the High Court at the time, resided with the states. Joe Lyons, his government decided we cannot have this. This is absolutely stupid, given the increase that aviation was underway right at that time. And they went to the polls in what they thought would be a pretty simple, pretty easy yes case. Gosh, they got it wrong. The no campaign is really interesting in this case, where the Labor Party at the time supported the idea, but railway unions were particularly concerned about this, and it became this whole conspiracy. Now, We talk about conspiracies today. Conspiracies have lived long in politics. So this was apparently a conspiracy to set up a federal air monopoly, which would stop the states setting up their own airlines, and it would also be the end of the railway system. And all these jobs in the railway industry and amongst country towns would be gone because somehow the ability of the federal government to regulate aviation to stop planes crashing into each other would lead to this. The states, like within months, gave up to the federal government their powers over aviation because they understood this was a stupid situation, but the voters had not seen through that.
Okay, I wanted to turn now to the broader history of referendums. When did they actually begin and why, and how many have there been?
There's been 44 since Federation. The first one was actually 1906. So the Commonwealth has its first parliament in 1901. So within 5 years, there's a push to make a change. It was a very technical one. The Senate at the time, a senator's term started on January 1, and they thought federal elections were going to be held regularly in March or April. They thought this was a problem. So they asked voters to allow Senate starting date to become July 1, which it is today. It was very uncontroversial, and off we go. There were 2 referendums in 1910, and this is clearly tied up with some of the issues that had come out of the setting up of the Constitution in the first place. So we've had 44 referendums, 3 within the first 9 years, and 2 of them had passed. You'd be going, oh yeah, Australians might be up for a bit of constitutional change. That is not how it's played out ever since.
All up, how many referendums have succeeded and how many have failed?
8 of the 44 questions have passed. And the successful referendums haven't actually moved power around all that much. Many of the unsuccessful referendums would have given more power to the federal government. So 1913, there was a referendum with 6 separate questions, which is hard to get your head around, that voters were asked 6 different things. And they were very different things like corporation law, industrial matters, railway disputes, nationalisation of monopolies. Each one of them got just over 49% of the vote. They all went down.
Okay, so that's interesting. The majority of referendums that haven't managed to get up in Australia, there's been an issue of, I guess, this federal shifting of power, which I guess brings us to the 1967 referendum, which is arguably an exception to that. Can you tell us a bit more about that one? That obviously has to be the most significant referendum on Indigenous rights before this current proposal.
Yeah, and the question itself, it actually enabled the federal government to count Indigenous Australians in the national census.
Why has it taken the white Australians just on 200 years to recognise us as a race of people?
The time has come when Australia can no longer tolerate legal racial discrimination against its Indigenous people.
It's a matter of democratic right.
The result of the referendum on the Aboriginal question was a resounding triumph for the Aboriginal cause. Australia recorded a yes vote of nearly 91%.
Now, that is not a threat to most people. It really is. It is very difficult to see how that is undermining your position within the democracy. That was actually the question. So you've got to keep that in mind. And 91% of people said, yep, okay, I can live with that. If I went to the seat of Kalgoorlie, which today is effectively the seat of O'Connor in Western Australia, which takes in Kalgoorlie, almost 1 in 3 people voted against that. And there was a large Aboriginal population in Kalgoorlie at the time. In other parts of Perth, in suburban Perth, 1 in 5 said no to actually counting Indigenous Australians in the census. Leichhardt, which is Cape York, 20%. So people had issues in 1967, just even with something as relatively simplistic.
Okay, and when it comes to other reasons why referendums tend to fail in Australia, naturally the 1999 failed referendum about whether Australia should become a republic or not springs to mind. Did that give us any insight to why referendums just don't tend to succeed here?
Well, yeah, it's similar to what's going on with the yes-no vote on The Voice at the moment. The Republic referendum started with strong support.
Now, when you bind those two together, it would be a travesty in common sense terms of Australian democracy for that proposition not to be put to the Australian people.
Republicans applauding John Howard. Savour the moment.
But the debate within the Republicans, it fell apart because there was a dispute within themselves what sort of republic Australia should have, whether it would be a president elected by the parliament or a president directly elected by the public.
I voted no. I voted no. I want to have a say in who they elect. That's all.
On both issues, yeah. No, we wouldn't be able to make the decision in the long run.
This was the best republic that the best brains of the Republican movement could come up with, and it could only get 45% support, and that is a
There are disputes within no cases littered all through our referendums, and you can see it even today. There are disputes within the no case right now. But if it's in the yes case, that's the death knell. And you can see some polls are picking up that people are worried that the yes side is not fully agreed on what sort of form the voice would take.
We'll be right back. Okay, and I wanted to ask you about the issue of double majority that's required for a successful referendum, which is, of course, that we need a majority of the national electorate to back a change in addition to a majority of the 6 states. So how much is that an issue in the success or failure of a referendum? And also, how much of a role does partisanship play?
Yeah, the double majority is a huge issue. It's a huge issue because we've had 4 to 5 referendum questions which have got more than 50% of the population over the line. But the people who put together the Constitution wanted to make it really difficult to make any change. So you have to get the 50% overall, but you need at least 4 of the 6 states. Now, the referendums that have passed have been unanimous across the states. You don't get a 5-1 or a 4-2. And again, that is telling you something. To be successful, you need broad support.
Okay, and I wanted to ask you about someone really fascinating you spoke to for the feature you've just written. You spoke to a referendum expert, Matt Quartrup, and he's a visiting professor of constitutional law at the Australian National University. And he famously forecast Brexit when that was going against what most of the polls were saying at the time. So what did he tell you?
He said the Yes campaign has been cactus almost from the start. He was very critical of the way that Anthony Albanese had framed the entire debate. It's interesting, Matt's argument, because Brexit only got up by about 0.4, 0.6 of the vote. Turnout was a key issue. You come to Australia, you actually have to turn up to vote, which makes us one of the more interesting democracies going around. In my view, it probably helps this democracy operates by forcing people to get out and vote. It doesn't help if you are advocating change, but it makes sure that we're all engaged and the major parties can't actually flirt with the absolute extremes of either the left or right to get their way, as we see in the United States.
Okay, so that's interesting. Unlike other countries, our problem isn't that not enough people, of course, are turning out to vote because we have to, but we've got constitutional issues clearly that make referendums hard to pass in Australia, most notably the double majority. There's also the matter of requiring bipartisan support, which this referendum clearly doesn't have. But I wonder, is there something else at play here, Shane, about Australia's perhaps resistance to change? Do you think that might play a role in why so many referendums in this country have failed?
I think it's beyond referendums. There's a reason why there have been so few changes in government, especially since World War II. Like people, they may grizzle and complain down the pub, but they don't go hard enough to change it. Most democracies do not go around changing their constitutions all that often. You can see that in the United States. This is why I come back to 1937. It seems a no-brainer why you would say this makes no sense, why we've got 6 states with their own legislation governing aviation. But running a negative case is so much easier than running a yes case.
So finally, Shane, do you think that this one has any chance to succeed at this point? What has this journey through history shown you?
I've been saying since last year that this would go down, and there has been nothing to have changed my mind about that. Even though I write economics, I'm a history nerd, and the history in this space tells you more than enough to say this was always going to struggle, and as it's gone on, it has played out as I thought it might have.
Shane, thank you so much for joining us.
No worries, Sam. Have a great day.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Tammy Mills. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au www.bbc.co.uk/subscribe. I'm Samantha Salinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.
Why do we have to choose one? With Optus, you can have it all. Get a great network with super fast 5G. Get value with 5G phone price match guarantee. Get amazing features like mobile turbocharge. With Optus, you can simply have it all. It starts with yes. 5G available in selected areas and on selected plans. Speeds vary. Check website for coverage and offer details, including T's and C's, exclusions, eligibility criteria and prices.